What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through my Week 4 wide receiver start sits, talking about every single matchup, talking about every single fantasy relevant wide receiver, and then listing them as either a start, fringe option, or a sit. The starts are going to be the wide receivers you feel confident firing up as your wide receiver 1, your wide receiver 2. These are very solid plays here in Week 4. The fringe options, more of your wide receiver 3s. The flex options, they're fine, but they're not the best options. And then sits, obviously players that you would prefer to keep on your bench. If you guys enjoy the video, smash that like button. Any questions, drop them down below. Timestamps will be in the description. But let's just dive right into the Thursday night matchup where we have the Cowboys taking on the Giants. And I will say, this has been a somewhat disappointing start from CeeDee Lamb. People drafted him to give you 20, 21, 22 plus PPR points per game. We have not seen that yet out of CeeDee Lamb, but what are you going to do? You still got to fire him up here as a wide receiver 1. Still super talented, still has Dak at the quarterback position. He should get better moving forward. And then I'm going to be sitting Jalen Tolbert and Brandon Cooks. Tolbert's actually been a pretty decent option over the last couple of weeks. I just don't think it's something that I want to trust, at least here in Week 4. So sitting those two. Then looking at the Giants here, I mean, I've got to talk about Malik Neighbors. I was super in on him heading into the season, but even I didn't predict that he would be, as insane as he's been through 3 weeks. He has been an absolute monster. He is the fantasy wide receiver 1. He's coming off a game where he commanded 12 targets, caught 8 of them for 78 yards and 2 touchdowns. He had like 2 circus catches in there also, 1 for a touchdown, which was just insane. But he's commanded 30 total targets over the past 2 weeks. He has 28 PPR points in back-to-back games. And the first time he did it, it was against the Commanders. So you could say, the matchup was good. Can he do it against a tougher matchup? Can Daniel Jones support him in a tougher matchup? And the answer was yes, because last week, Week 3, he did that stat line against the Cleveland Browns, which is one of the best defenses in the NFL. So Malik Neighbors is legit. He might already be like a top 5 wide receiver in the NFL at this point. Like, he is that good. So Malik Neighbors has got to be a start. And then I'm going to be sitting Wan'Dale Robinson, who's actually been pretty decent to start off the year. I think he's averaging like between 11 and 12 PPR points per game. But just on this offense, I don't know if I want to be trusting Wan'Dale Robinson in my lineup. Maybe when we're getting into bye weeks, we have some more injuries, then he could become relevant. But here in Week 4, would prefer to have him as a sit. Now, looking at the Saints-Falcons divisional matchup here, starting off with the Saints, I really liked Chris Olave as a buy low after the first 2 weeks. The Saints offense had looked good. We know Chris Olave's talented. He just hadn't come through fantasy-wise. He goes out Week 3, has a really nice game, so he's locked in as a start here. I have Rashid Shaheed listed as a fringe option, and I got a lot of grief in my comments last week for listing him as a fringe option after 2 strong weeks to start off the season, and his Week 3 was kind of my concern. He went out, laid a goose egg, and I'm not out on Rashid Shaheed. Like you can see, after a really bad game, I still have him here as a fringe option. But I think through 2 weeks, people were fooled that that was something he was going to do every single week moving forward. He's a big play threat. He has that big play upside, but you just can't be banking on him ripping off like a 50-plus yard reception every single week. It's just not sustainable. So he doesn't have the highest weekly floor, but I still think he can be a solid wide receiver 3. He didn't catch a pass, but he's still at a 25% target share. I'm not freaking out on Rashid Shaheed. Like, maybe if you thought he would be like a wide receiver 1 every single week, then maybe you should be panicking because he's probably not going to do that. But I think he is what we kind of expected after 2 weeks. He's a boom or bust option. I think he can give you that high ceiling. He's a great big play threat. I'm not panicking on the Saints offense after 1 down game, but I think he does settle more to like that wide receiver 3 area as opposed to like a locked in set it and forget it option every single week. Then looking at the Falcons here, we have back-to-back strong performances from Drake London. Kirk Cousins has looked fine, good enough to support Drake London here. So London's going to be a start for me. I have Darnell Mooney as a sit. He has been fairly interesting over the past couple of weeks. We'll see if he, can log another successful game here. I mean, if he puts up 3 straight solid performances, I'd probably have to bump him up at least into fringe territory. But right now, being a little bit patient here with Darnell Mooney. Now looking at the Bengals Panthers matchup here, for the Bengals, kind of an interesting wide receiver room to break down at this point. Jamar Chase had, a slow start, down a couple of weeks to start off the season. But I mean, he goes out with a monster Week 3. There really never should have been any panic with Jamar Chase. So he's a locked-in start. We saw T. Higgins back, and my concern with T. Higgins was that he was going to come in and play a very limited role coming off the hamstring injury. We actually didn't really see that. His routes were solid. He just didn't have a great fantasy day. We actually saw Yoshi Voss had a pretty solid day, for the Bengals here on Monday Night Football. Despite that, I still think T. Higgins is the guy here. He was running the wide receiver 2 routes. We know he's talented. I think he's just going to settle in here. So I have him as a fringe option until we really see him, start to break out. But at this point, I think he's a nice wide receiver 3 play. And then sitting Yoshi Voss, he's been a touchdown threat, has logged a couple of solid games here. But with Higgins back, I don't think he's going to be a super reliable week-to-week option. And then for the Panthers, I feel like they have one fantasy-relevant wide receiver at this point, and it is Deontay Johnson. And he looked like he was pretty much left for dead after the first 2 weeks with Bryce Young at quarterback. Andy Dalton came in, pretty much brought his fantasy value back to life. 13 targets, 8 receptions, 122 receiving yards, and a touchdown on a 38% target share. The first 2 weeks combined, he had logged 5 receptions for 34 yards. So Deontay Johnson is the Panthers' clear-cut number 1 target. I think he's going to be a solid option moving forward. Now, Andy Dalton's not going to go out and throw for 300-plus yards and 3 touchdowns every single week, but Deontay has the volume. I think he's going to have a decent floor because of that, and I do think he's a solid start here going up against the Bengals, whose offense did just get torched by Jaden Daniels and the Commanders. Now, looking at the Rams taking on the Bears, for the Rams, I was kind of off on how these wide receivers were used heading into week 3, because in week 2, with Cooper Kupp gone, we saw the 3 guys that were, pretty much getting those starting opportunities were Demarcus Robinson, Jordan Whittington stepped into the Cooper Kupp role, and then Tyler Johnson was like that third option. Jordan Whittington and Tyler Johnson ended up splitting their snaps, their routes in week 3, and Tutu Atwell actually stepped into a starting spot. He was second on the team in routes run, had an 80% route participation, and he logged 4 receptions for 93 yards. And what I like about Tutu Atwell is it's not just that he had one decent game here, but he actually has a track record of producing with Cooper Kupp out of the lineup. In his first 3 games in 2023, when Kupp was on IR, he went 6 for 119, 7 for 77, and then 4 for 50 and a touchdown. So for Tutu Atwell, I think he's a fine back-end wide receiver 3 play. It's tough to fully trust any of these Rams wide receivers with Puka and Kupp out, but if I did have to go with one, it would have to be Tutu Atwell here, sitting Demarcus Robinson, Jordan Whittington, and Tyler Johnson. Looking at the Bears here, DJ Moore had been a little underwhelming through 2 weeks, but he had been fine in PPR formats. He wasn't burying you. He goes out, has a pretty solid week 3 here. Bears throw for a ton of volume, but I think the big story, at least at the wide receiver position from this game, was Rome Odunze, because he had a breakout week 3, commanded 11 targets, caught 6 of them for 112 yards and a touchdown. And I think this was a big deal for Rome Odunze, not just to put up, a solid game early on, but to do it in a game with Keenan Allen out. Because I think the concern for Odunze early on in the season was that Keenan Allen was going to be getting the wide receiver 2 snaps. Rome Odunze would kind of have to, either produce as the wide receiver 3 or actually overtake Keenan Allen for those number 2 opportunities. And I think with Keenan Allen out and that big performance, he might have just locked down the wide receiver 2 snaps. Maybe for the rest of the season here. So I'm listing him as a fringe play. I will say I feel a lot more confident farming up Odunze if Keenan Allen does miss another game. If Allen's back, maybe he's more in that high-end wide receiver 4 territory, but still someone who's probably playable here. For a lot of these rookies, once they show us they're talented, they're good, we should believe them. So Rome Odunze, I think he's definitely playable at this point. And then I still like DJ Moore as a start. Now looking at a divisional matchup between the Vikings and the Packers, for the Vikings here, I have Justin Jefferson, obviously as a start. If you drafted Jefferson, there was definitely some concern with the quarterback play. Could Sam Darnold actually support him? Through 3 weeks, the answer is 100% yes. And if we were redrafting, he probably would be the wide receiver 1, maybe wide receiver 2 behind Jamar Chase at this point. So Justin Jefferson, obviously you're starting him. And then I think Jordan Addison becomes a lot more interesting now. We've seen Jalen Naylor catch touchdowns in 3 straight weeks. Jordan Addison's been out with an ankle injury. If we're getting good injury reports that he's good to go, I think he's definitely playable as a wide receiver 3. I wasn't overly high on Addison coming into the season because I did have those quarterback concerns, like going from Kirk Cousins to Sam Darnold. Would we actually be able to support a second wide receiver here? I think through 3 weeks, the answer is yes here with Jordan Addison. So even though he's been out, I think when he steps back in, he's a talented player, definitely is playable. And then even though Naylor has caught, touchdown passes in 3 straight weeks, I don't think he's super fantasy relevant with or without Addison in the lineup. Now looking at the Packers here, I just don't really know what to make of this Jordan Love injury. This is going to be assuming that Love misses another game. I don't really see why they push it with how well they've played without him. Obviously, they're better with Jordan Love in the lineup, but they can clearly win games without him. So I don't think they're going to risk it. If Love is not playing, I think you just can't play any of these wide receivers. There's just not enough passing volume. If Love is back, then I'd probably bump up Jaden Reed to like a fringe option, sit in the rest of these dudes. Just a tough matchup against the Vikings, which, I mean, Brian Flores has kind of become like the boogeyman on defense because they've been locking down teams back-to-back weeks. Texans week 3, 49ers week 2. That defense is looking tough. So if Love plays, Reed is a fringe play, sit in the rest of these dudes. If Love does not play, all of them are just going to be sits for me. Now, pivoting over to the Jaguars Texans matchup here, both these teams are coming off of clunkers in week 3. The Jaguars just got embarrassed on Monday Night Football. And even though Christian Kirk finally had his first solid game of the season, I'm still going to have him as a sit. He was just such a non-factor week 1, week 2, that like week 3 with a lot of garbage time production, that's not swaying me here. So going to be sitting Christian Kirk. I still like Brian Thomas Jr. as a fringe play. If this offense inspired more confidence, I would have him as a start. I do think he's going to be their top option rest of season. But with how rough they looked, this isn't necessarily a smash matchup here against this Texans defense. So Thomas Jr. is going to be a fringe play for me. It's like a wide receiver 3, and then also sitting Gabe Davis. Now looking at the Texans here, kind of a down game overall from this offense. Nico Collins, Stephon Diggs, I feel like they've earned the right to be starts here. Nico Collins, somewhat of a down game, but he was so dominant week 1, week 2. Tough to fault him a ton there. Tank Dell, I dropped him to a fringe play. Actually had his best fantasy game, but it's just one of those spots where I still think he can have his weeks where he's the top option, but when he hasn't been like a top 1 or even 2 option in the first 3 games, it's tough for me to have him as a start with those other dudes. So I think he's more of like a wide receiver 3 at this point. Shifting over to the Steelers-Colts matchup here, not a great situation here at the wide receiver position for either of these guys, but I still have George Pickens as a fringe play, commanding decent volume. The Steelers actually let Justin Fields go out there and sling a little bit, and he looked good when he was doing it. So Pickens, think he's a fine wide receiver 3. He also is just due for like, a big play where he puts together like 5 for 100 and a touchdown. Like those games are going to happen. So Pickens wouldn't be overly concerned. Sitting Calvin Austin, who actually had a pretty solid game, but not someone who I think is going to be fantasy relevant. And then looking at the Colts here, Michael Pittman, someone where on most platforms was drafted as like a top 24 wide receiver. I think on ESPN, he was like a 2-3 turn pick. And this has just been an awful start to the season. He has not hit 8 PPR points, and he has not hit 40 yards in a single game. Richardson isn't playing super well. He has not been accurate, and his skill set also just doesn't align with Michael Pittman's. This is something I've been talking about over the past few weeks, but Richardson, he's not super accurate, but he can make sensational plays. But his sensational plays are typically down the field to a guy like Alec Pierce. It could be A.D. Mitchell. Those plays are not to Michael Pittman, so Pittman is losing out on him, by not being super accurate, but he's not getting the benefit of some of those bombs that Richardson can, bring to this offense. So I just cannot make an argument for Michael Pittman being startable at this point. He's a talented player. I'm sure he'll have his fine games throughout the season, but this situation is just pretty much worst case scenario for him. We saw Josh Downs back in the lineup, but really not interested in starting him or Alec Pierce. In the next game, we have the Broncos taking on the Jets, and I do have Courtland Sutton as a sit, coming off his best fantasy game of the season, but I do think there's some room for optimism moving forward. This Broncos passing attack looked significantly better than what we had seen weeks 1, weeks 2, and just not a great matchup here against the Jets. I think in a better matchup, maybe he'd be a fringe option. So I think rest of season, there is some hope for Courtland Sutton, but here in week 4, going up against the Jets, someone who I'd prefer to not have to play. And then for the Jets, kind of a slow start to the season for Garrett Wilson. He's kind of been hit with a gauntlet at corner and just defenses in general through the first 3 weeks. I think he'll be fine. The volume's there. This could be his breakout game here, except for he probably does draw the Pat Surtain matchup. So maybe he has to get through another one of these tough matchups, and then it'll be smooth sailing, but still someone who's playable. It's probably like a wide receiver 1, at worst, high-end wide receiver 2. Allen Lazard has actually been decent to start off the season. To me, it seems a little bit fluky. It seems like these matchups where Garrett Wilson isn't balling, so they're kind of pivoting to Lazard. He's really not someone I want to trust in my fantasy lineup. For Mike Williams, he's gaining routes within this offense, kind of settling back in from that injury. Could be someone who's relevant later on, but here in week 4, definitely not someone who I want to play. We're going to have the Eagles taking on the Buccaneers. And for the Eagles, this wide receiver room is kind of in shambles at this point. Devonta Smith, I mean, very scary hit, pretty much got knocked out cold. So would be shocked if he plays here in week 4. We have A.J. Brown, who said he'd miss at least a couple of games. It's been 2. Maybe he's back here in week 4. If A.J. Brown's playing, he's going to be a start. If he's not playing, I mean, I think we're just fading this Eagles wide receiver room at this point if A.J. Brown can't go. And then for the Buccaneers, another game with Chris Godwin giving you strong production. Mike Evans a little bit underwhelming. I think you continue to fire up both these guys as strong plays, but at this point, it's tough to not view Chris Godwin as the top option at this point. I don't think there's a massive difference, but this is something I'd kind of been preaching coming into the season and also early on in the season. Last year was an outlier in terms of Mike Evans being the significantly better option. In previous seasons when Godwin was in the slot, the production was neck and neck, so it's not shocking to me that Chris Godwin is having a really strong start to this year. In the next game, we have the Commanders taking on the Cardinals, and we finally got to see some life out of Terry McLaurin here in week 3. Maybe coming off a huge week 3, you think it's harsh that I have him here as a fringe option. I'm not completely sold that this is going to be like an every week thing, but for the first 2 weeks, there was just no upside with this Commanders passing attack. Terry McLaurin was wildly, underwhelming early on. But then week 3, we see them pushing the ball down the field. He catches 2 deep passes from Jaden Daniels. I mean, beautiful throws from Jaden Daniels. So that was definitely fun to see. We're going to need to see it on a little bit more of a consistent basis for me to want to fire him up as like a really strong wide receiver 1 or wide receiver 2. But I do think we're trending in the right direction here. It was a great game from both of those guys, so he's going to be a fringe play. On the other side with the Cardinals, Marvin Harrison Jr. logged another very solid game. Seems like we've completely moved past like the, pretty much nothing burger in week 1. So Marvin Harrison Jr., think he's a very solid start at this point. And then sitting Michael Wilson, coming off a decent game, and then also sitting Greg Dortch here. Now we're going to have the Patriots taking on the 49ers. It was good to see the Patriots get something out of the wide receiver position with Demario Douglas, but I mean, we can't be talking about starting any of these Pats wide receivers at this point. So sitting all of those guys. For the 49ers, Brandon Ayuk has definitely been underwhelming. I'm still going to roll with him as a start here. He's a talented player. He's on a good offense. Brock Purdy's playing well. I think this is just kind of a slow ramp up from not being involved in training camp, but I'm a believer in the talent. I'm going to continue to go back to the well here on Brandon Ayuk. The huge story from this game, at least at the wide receiver position for the Niners, was Juwan Jennings putting together just a nuclear performance, targeted 12 times, caught 11 of them for 175 yards and 3 touchdowns. That's just an insane game, I mean, for anyone, but especially for like a non-starting wide receiver stepping up due to injuries. Like to have that kind of performance, that just doesn't happen, right? It's not the running back position where the backup can come in and just get force-fed the ball and produce. At wide receiver, you have to be getting open. You have to be earning these targets. You have to be making the plays, and Juwan Jennings was doing that. Also, just a big shout out to Brock Purdy here, because the knock on him, throughout his entire career has been that he's getting carried by weapons. He has this stacked wide receiver core with Debo, Ayuk, George Kittle, CMC at the running back position. This offense has been decimated by injuries, and Brock Purdy's still balling. So shout out to him. There's no way I can't list Juwan Jennings as a start after going 11 for 175 and 3 touchdowns. So both Ayuk and Juwan Jennings are going to be starts for me. Now looking at the Chiefs-Chargers matchup here, for the Chiefs, you got to continue to fire up Rashee Rice as a wide receiver 1. The dude's a stud. He's commanding volume. He has that big play upside, and at this point is the Chiefs' clear-cut number 1 target. And then for Xavier Worthy, kind of another down game. At this point early on in the season, he's definitely a boom or bust option, but I still think he's playable as like a wide receiver 3. And then for the Chargers, we've got some Justin Herbert, injury concerns here. Going to be sitting Quentin Johnston and Ladd McConkey. I think one or both of these dudes could be relevant down the stretch, but if Herbert's banged up, potentially not playing, I mean, these dudes are unplayable in my opinion. We're going to have the Browns taking on the Raiders, and we had a nice bounce back game here out of Amari Cooper. I'm not, fully back in on Cooper here. I'm definitely not in on this Browns offense. There's been a lot of passing volume, but the yardage is not there. The touchdowns have not been there. So Cooper is going to have good games just because he is a very good NFL wide receiver. But I think at best case, he's like wide receiver 3. And then sitting Jerry Jeudy, Elijah Moore. Then for the Raiders here, going to be starting Devontae Adams. Kind of a down game. Seems like Antonio Pierce may have been throwing shots at him after the game about him making some business decisions. I saw people talk about how that could have been directed at Devontae Adams. To be honest, I don't really care. Like, you can't bench Devontae Adams. I don't think they're going to bench Devontae Adams. So if he's out there playing, he's a start for me. And then sitting Jacoby Myers and Trey Tucker, who had the solid performances, just on this Raiders offense, you don't want to be playing either of those dudes. I believe this is Sunday Night Football. We have the Bills taking on the Ravens. And for the Bills here, I think at this point through 3 weeks, the best wide receiver option they have is Khalil Shakir. So I'm firing up as a fringe play. I don't think he's a smash start by any means. They're going to spread the ball around, but he's getting the routes. He's had some decent performances coming off a nice week 3. He's going to be a fringe play. Kind of weird usage from Keon Coleman. He was a guy that was like leading this team in routes week 1 and week 2. Wasn't doing a ton with it, but then in week 3, he doesn't even touch the field on the first 2 drives. Does end up scoring a touchdown, but until we see that usage jump back up, I mean, he's definitely unplayable. Sitting Mac Hollins, sitting Curtis Samuel. And then for the Ravens here, Zay Flowers had his first down game, kind of to be expected when the Ravens just like barely passed the ball against the Cowboys. This is probably not going to be a similar game script to what we saw last week. Zay Flowers is going to be a solid start. And then sitting Rashad Bateman. Looking at, I think, the first Monday night game, we have the Titans taking on the Dolphins. For the Titans here, I have Calvin Ridley as a fringe option. He had the big week 2, then flopped in week 3. For D-Hop here, I have him as a sit. He had his first big game, but his usage is still not back to 100%. He was at a 50% route participation. So even though he's coming off a decent performance, if I don't know that D-Hop's getting 70, 80, plus percent of the routes, then I just can't play him within this offense. I think Ridley's fine as like a back-end wide receiver 3, but like we saw in week 3, I just don't think he's a super inspiring option. Just not a great offense, now competing with DeAndre Hopkins, increasing his usage. And then for the Dolphins here, I'm still starting Tyreek Hill. Him and Waddle both had a down game. The Dolphins offense looked terrible. I still think Tyreek Hill is just too talented to sit. So even if he's a wide receiver 2, he's still a start for me. And then I still have Waddle as a fringe option. The talent's there. Definitely a little bit more boom or bust without Tua in the lineup. But I still think you can make the case. He's like a wide receiver 3, at worst like a high-end wide receiver 4. And then the final game of the week, Seahawks taking on the Lions. For the Seahawks, we had another big game out of DK Metcalf. He's a set it and forget it start in your lineup. JSN kind of came back down to earth after a huge week 2. We have 1 monster performance and then 2 not so great ones. I think this is a fun matchup here against the Lions, and I still think he's playable as a wide receiver 3. And then Tyler Lockett, I just view him as the third option on this team. Could he have some fine games? Sure. But in terms of actually trusting him in your fantasy football lineup, I'd prefer not to. And then the final team here, the Lions. Obviously, I'm on Ross St. Brown, a lock in your lineup. But I did want to talk about Jameson Williams because I'm still holding strong with him as a start. I wasn't like overly in on JMO heading into the year. I think he was a fine pick, was pretty in line with consensus. But I'm not panicking after his first down game, was targeted 3 times, caught one of them for 9 yards. I think the fact that Sam Laporta is banged up is definitely a plus for Jameson Williams because it pretty much just locks him in as like a number 2 target on this team. But through 3 weeks, JMO's been targeted 23 times and he's logged 3 carries. For someone with the big playability that Jameson Williams has, I mean, getting 26 opportunities in 3 weeks, for me, that's enough volume to want him in my lineup, even though he does have a fairly low floor, like we saw in week 3. I think the upside makes it worth it. So I definitely think he's around that like wide receiver 24 area. So someone who I think is still a decent start, even though he's coming off a down game. And that's going to wrap it up for my week 4 wide receiver start sits. Any questions, drop them down below. Let me know your thoughts. If you enjoyed, hit that like button, subscribe. But thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.